the impact of racism on medical education and the effects of such issues up to today. The information in here is not something that's coming from like the late 1800s or something like that. Participants were asked to determine whether statements such as black skin is thicker than whites was true or false. 25 to 42% of UVA medical students and residents responded true. That very false belief showed up in the way that they looked at black patients dealing with pain. I just don't want to get into the issues at play, but also how we can address these types of issues. Hey, my name is Charpentier, and welcome to Less Than 3%, where we talk about healthcare, my journey becoming a physician, and really anything from the perspective of a black male pursuing medicine. And in this episode, I want to get into something that has really been covered pretty extensively on the podcast so far, and that really has to do with the impact of racism on medical education and the effects of such issues up to today. And really in this episode, I want to cover something a little bit more specific, and that has to do with what I would say is really the foundation of all medical practice, because we can talk a lot about how there are different health disparities when it comes to patient outcomes and how there may be certain issues when it comes to physicians practicing medicine and the way they do it. But ultimately, the one thing that's seriously going to matter at the foundation, I would say, is not simply the medical practice, but the medical education. And so in this episode, what I want to cover is the impact of racism on medical education and the effects of such issues up to today. I really want to get into a couple of articles and some information that I think can really help bring context to this specific issue. And to do so, I first actually want to take a look at a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's titled Racial Biology and Medical Misconceptions. And I thought this really helped to provide some good information to really segue into the topic that we're going to talk about today. And they first go into citing an article that talks about something that I actually specifically remember covering previously on the podcast. And that has to do with a paper that they mentioned was published in 2016, which documented ongoing racial misconceptions that were held by medical students and residents. And I think one of the things I actually want to preface as I go into what they're quoting in this paper is the fact that the information in here is not something that's coming from like the late 1800s or something like that. Keep in mind that this is a study in 2016. This is something that was performed relatively recently. And what they mentioned from the study that they quote is that the author showed a series of statements concerning biologic differences between groups described as blacks and whites to three groups of white people: participants with no medical training, medical students at the University of Virginia, and UVA residents. Participants were asked to determine whether statements such as black skin is thicker than whites was true or false. And what they found just with that specific example of black people's skin was that 58% of the lay public, so just regular people, but also 25 to 42% of UVA medical students and residents responded true. And they go on to say that basically the study really just showed that multiple false beliefs were shared by public and medical trainees. And I want to directly segue right into another paper that really helps corroborate the overall point that I'm trying to bring here. So there's another study that was published in the NIH journal, another paper titled Racial Bias in Pain Assessment and Treatment Recommendations and False Beliefs About Biological Differences Between Blacks and Whites. So they pretty much go into the same sort of issue with a little bit more detail. So they talk about the fact that Black Americans are systemically undertreated for pain relative to white Americans, which is really what I was highlighting in terms of what I remember previously going over a little bit on the podcast. And what they really examined was not just simply these false beliefs, but also the type of impact that these beliefs could have directly when it came to medical care. And so they look at a couple of studies. So the first study they mentioned documented these beliefs among white laypersons and revealed that participants who more strongly endorsed false beliefs about biological differences between black and white patients reported lower pain ratings for a black target. So basically what this is showing is that the same people who endorse false beliefs about the differences between black and white patients, that very false belief showed up in the way that they looked at black patients dealing with pain. In the second study, they mentioned that they extend these findings to the medical context, and they found that more than half a sample of white medical students and residents endorsed these beliefs. This is going back to medical students and residents, and they found that participants who endorsed these beliefs rated Black patients' pain as lower and made less accurate treatment recommendations. So I think this directly shows how a misunderstanding and misinformation when it comes to different ethnic groups and ultimately different patients can seriously impact how someone is going to treat their actual patients. And so with that being said, I just want to really show how just simply having misinformation and false beliefs and ultimately being miseducated in some sense, or maybe not being educated on the right information, can ultimately play into how a patient is being treated. So if medical students don't necessarily have the right beliefs about certain groups of individuals and ultimately patients, it can definitely show itself in the way they're actually going to make their treatment decisions. And so that's why I think it's so important that we understand this whole idea of misinformation and racism in medical education and really just how serious of an issue this can be. So one thing I really wanted to take a look at is just what is the extent of potential misinformation when it comes to medical students, or where could this be coming from? And I think one of the best ways to really get in the head of medical students when it comes to actually taking in information, learning different material, and ultimately practicing that material is really the resources that medical students are going to use to understand this material. And getting back into the paper on racial biology and medical misconceptions, there are some things that were discussed when it came to some of these medical resources. So they go on to explain that the racialization of disease is propagated in textbooks and reinforced through medical licensing exams and the test prep industry. And some of the examples I give, before I go into them, I definitely want to preface that the examples that are quoted here are coming from quite a few years back. So it's not necessarily to say that the same issues that they bring up in these examples are still going on with these specific sources. And with that being said, what they mentioned is that a 2011 evaluation of the 8th edition of the Robbins and Coltrane Pathologic Basis of Disease textbook found that of 31 statements linking African ancestry with disease, 17% of those statements could not be confirmed by the literature, and 3 of those were directly contradicted. Another example they give is that in 2017, an examination of the use of race and ethnicity in the UWorld Step 1 Q Bank, which is a very, very popular source of practice questions for medical students, showed variation in whether a racial or ethnic descriptor was central to correct interpretation of a question or merely incidental, whereas the descriptor white or Caucasian was central in only 7.4% of questions. For Native Americans, race was diagnostic for a certain issue 100% of the time. So the real issue that I want to point out, if you haven't noticed already, is that what we're finding is that when it comes to certain medical conditions and things like that, you have different backgrounds such as African American, Native American being linked with certain diseases, potentially a lot more hastily than when it comes to a white or Caucasian patient being presented in a certain question. So ultimately, the major issue that I'm finding here is that many issues have, I would say, really been conflated with genetic predisposition when it can actually be tied to other issues such as medical racism. And this point is something that is thoroughly emphasized in the next piece of information I want to take a look at, which is a paper that was published in Penn Medicine News titled How Medical Schools Can Transform Curriculums to Undo Racial Biases. Because I just don't want to get into the issues at play, but also how we can address these types of issues. And with that being said, what this paper goes on to mention is a quote that I thought was very, very helpful. And as this quote states, in medical school, 20 years ago, we often learned that higher rates of hypertension in certain racial and ethnic groups was due to genetic predisposition, personal behaviors, or unfortunate circumstances. Now we know that this is not true. There are no characteristics innate to racial and ethnic groups, biological or otherwise, that adequately explains these differences. They stem instead from differential experiences in our society. It's structural racism, not race. So at least one point that I found interesting in this quote that was mentioned is ultimately highlighting the fact that it's not just as simple as genetic factors with one race or another, but a lot of times it's really structural racism that can play a huge role in the mix. And I think one key example of this is something that I think about and I've heard about all the time, which is when it often comes to African Americans, one of the things that gets brought up is that we're often a lot more prone to diseases such as hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular issues such as those. And one of the things that I've noticed has often been brought up is really this concept and this idea of nature versus nurture. Really this idea of it not just being as simple as some sort of genetic predisposition, but some of the factors that we have to think about is, okay, if a certain community seems to be at a higher risk of hypertension or these sorts of issues and disorders, could it be that it's not as simple as someone not eating enough healthy foods or things like that, but maybe one of the factors that contributes to it is, are they living in a food desert? Are they maybe struggling with some type of food insecurity? Could it be that they might have a lot more access to certain fast food restaurants, but maybe not enough access when it comes to quality supermarkets? Could it be different factors such as those? And I think that's really one of the major points that's being brought up here. Now, with all that being said, the question I would then raise is, what's being done to help? What can be done to really try to combat this issue? And for this, I want to take a look at a couple quotes that were mentioned in this article that, again, I think were very helpful. For instance, one thing that they mention is that it's important, and this is really what ties into medical education, it's important that we're appropriately contextualizing racial and ethnic differences in disease burden, which includes structural and social determinants of disease. So as I'd really just mentioned, it can't just be as simple as genetics with this group or that group, but we have to really consider everything in its proper context, which includes how structural racism and how different social determinants can play into certain groups and communities of people's health. And this is one of the things that really has to be emphasized in medical education, whether it comes to in the classroom, whether it may even come down to certain resources, textbooks, questions that are being used by medical students. These are really things that really all people in the medical education process have to have in consideration. Another thing they bring up is the importance of generating and imparting evidence-based medical knowledge when it comes to race, such as reforming board examinations to avoid testing students on race-based clinical guidelines and racial heuristics. That really just goes back to the point that was brought up before about how with certain races and practice questions, you can really have just the factor of race be completely diagnostic for certain issues. And so what I would just want to leave us with is the fact that I really think it's important that we are properly contextualizing differences and making sure that everything is evidence-based in our knowledge and our claims. And so with this episode, I really just want to give a solid overview of how, when it comes to issues dealing with health disparities and medical treatment not being as high of quality when it comes to different ethnic groups of patients, it isn't as simple as just what's on the surface with medical treatment, but the foundation of it is also going to have to do with medical education as one of the major factors. And so in terms of really dealing with medical education, making sure that's solid, we have to be aware of some of the issues that I lined out in this episode, which had to do with not really leaning holistically enough when it has to do with different health issues that have to do with different ethnic groups. And so I think, again, we just have to make sure that we're properly contextualizing all the information that we have when it comes to different groups being affected by different diseases with factors such as social determinants and systemic racism and all these different things. And so I just really hope in this episode that you're really able to leave with a much more holistic view and a better understanding of some of the different things that play into disease when it comes to certain groups, and how even just issues like these and things that may seem small when it comes to just medical education, just what type of role they can play in medical practice for patients, because medical students aren't just students. Ultimately, the medical students of today are the doctors of tomorrow and the people who are going to take care of the patients of tomorrow. And so with that being said, that really just closes out this episode. I hope you got a lot out of it, and let's see what we talk about in the next one.